Nancy and Larry. Thank you, Kim Hiett Jordan, and everyone else who made this possible at the Dallas Institute. I could not be happier. As you heard, the Hiett Prize has been awarded for 10 years now, and when I consider the previous 9 winners, I feel humbled and also motivated. I want to do my best to live up to the promise represented by this award. I'm pleased to note that 2 of the first 10 Hiett Prize winners, the 10th and the first, myself and Brad Gregory, are alumni of Utah State University, so go Aggies. I'm likewise pleased to note that 2 of the 10, Jimmy McWilliams and me, are environmental historians. You already heard that I like to call myself, it's really a joke or a half joke, an earth-based humanist. For sure, I'm a terrestrial scholar. My area of scholarship overlaps with landscape history and cultural geography, but my career project is larger. I want to expand the study of landscape to include every possible dimension. I need to pull this down? All right. You can't hear, I'm sorry. Should I start over or? Okay. Sometimes I do resort to neologisms to describe my work. I could say, I'm an anthrogeomorphologist, or I study geohumanism, and that's like my Twitter, handle is geohumanist. And I would describe geohumanism simply as the study of humans through the natural world with the recognition that nature contains a lot of culture and vice versa. While non-human things, both animate and inanimate, appear prominently in my work, so do people, in all their glorious and folly-filled capacities for imagination and engineering. The starting points for my 3 books have been not just a river, a mountain, and trees, but a dammed river, a legendary mountain, and iconic and introduced trees. So really it's about people as well as nature. There's a lot of, you can learn a lot about people by looking at trees. That's one thing I took away from my last project. So what's next, you may ask? A book about rocks? Well, as a matter of fact, at some point in the future, I do plan to write a book about the humanity of stones, by which I mean how the Stone Age in some ways never ended, how rocks are still a major component of economic and spiritual activities, and how our species continues to demonstrate a powerfully lithic imagination when it comes to 2 of the most human of activities, making art and commemorating the dead. But today I'm not going to talk in detail about rocks or rivers or mountains or trees. Instead, I'll offer some thoughts on 3 topics of wider relevance. The first is the future of the humanities in a time of academic crisis. The second is the promise of the environmental humanities in a time of planetary crisis. And I'll end with my personal articles of faith on the value of studying history. As you may know, the humanities are widely reported to be in a state of crisis. By that I mean reporters and columnists say so because people they talk to say so. As a historian, I tend to be unmoved by such pronouncements, knowing that a few minutes of research will reveal that commentators have been declaring crisis in the humanities more or less continuously since the early 20th century, when American universities started creating professional departments, divisions, and colleges around humanities disciplines. It's old news. The contemporary so-called crisis can be any number of crises, some real, some exaggerated, some concocted. The structural ones and the slow ones get less media attention. There is a long-term hiring crisis at the tenure track level, and there is a long-term publication crisis, which is to say a tenure and promotion crisis in academic disciplines like literature and history that privilege scholarly production in the form of printed books when, as you know, the old economic models of publishers, bookstores, and libraries have been upended. On top of it all, there is a long-term crisis in public funding of humanities research and programming. But these kind of creeping predicaments might as well be invisible when manufactured crises get attention so easily. Certain figures on the political right, including David Horowitz and Lynn Cheney, long ago turned the campus into another culture war venue. They have excoriated the university for offering safe haven to radical left-wing, intolerant, anti-conservative, anti-Christian, America-hating professors of the humanities, secular humanists becoming a code for militant atheists, subversives and subalternites who indoctrinate students in neo-Marxism or anything goes moral relativism or slavish white guilt political correctness. Pick your poison. Meanwhile, from a libertarian perspective, tenured humanities professors like myself have been characterized as lazy, unmotivated, inefficient, ossified, as moochers of state funds and takers of summer vacations of decidedly un-American duration. More sympathetic critics, including Richard Posner or Nick Kristof and David Brooks of the New York Times, portray academic humanists as victims of metaphorical suicide or self-neutering from the good old days when white male professors like Arthur Schlesinger Sr. and Jr. were towering generalists and public intellectuals engaged with the great issues of the day. Humanists have supposedly all become balkanized residents of ivory towers who worship French cultural theory and deliberately write obscure works on hyper-specialized topics for tiny audience of fellow jargonizers tenured departments of irrelevance. Yet these same people, we are told, feel free to pontificate on topics outside their expertise, especially US military and foreign policy. Meanwhile, voices from inside humanities departments, voices overwhelmingly from the political left, it should be said, bemoan the corporatization of the university and the proliferation of professional administrators who threaten to turn civic and moral education into a standardized protocol of human resource goals and measures. That is, reducing the liberal arts to the level of a for-profit service industry. Seen from within big state schools, the humanities appear to be tiny cogs in a vast money-making machine with three engines, de facto minor league sports clubs, grant-based science labs, and independently endowed and branded professional schools. So many crises to choose from, and I'm not even through the list. Since the Great Recession, the crisis du jour has been the putatively hopeless employment prospects for liberal arts majors. Legislators and governors in states such as Texas, Florida, Wisconsin, and Utah have ridiculed liberal arts BAs as degrees to nowhere from programs that suck resources away from real disciplines that train students for real jobs. There have been proposals to institute variable tuition within state universities, with humanities students paying more because the market has decided that their degree is worth less. Certain Republicans have proposed formulas for state funding that would reward high-demand fields at the expense of those supposedly in low demand. Gender studies is a target of political opportunity, while for some reason art history major has become the butt of political jokes. Even President Obama made an unfortunate Freudian slip in a stump speech at a Wisconsin manufacturing plant. He later issued a handwritten apology to an art history professor who called him out. And I'm going to read you what Obama wrote. He said, "I was making a point about the jobs market, not the value of art history. As it so happens, art history was one of my favorite subjects in high school, and it has helped me take a great deal of joy in my life that I might otherwise have missed." Now, that's very nice, but even in contriteness, Obama got it wrong. As is so common with politics on both sides of the aisle, the facts on jobs don't support the talking points. It turns out that unemployment rates for recent liberal arts majors are no worse. I mean, they're not great, but they're no worse than math and computer science majors, and they are much better than workers in the manufacturing sector. Speaking as someone who has attended his share of history department graduations, I'm no longer amused by commencement speakers who tell parents in half jest how wonderfully indulgent they were to have supported their child's pursuit of the impractical. Like, ha ha ha, your child majored in history. In point of fact, the skills vital for doing history, assiduous research, analytical thinking, effective communication, are highly valued in the information economy and are applicable to almost every area of skilled employment. Basically, if you complete college with proficiency in writing and editing, you may never become rich, but your skills will not go unrewarded. In its recent report on the future of jobs, The Economist listed editors alongside physical therapists and clergy as the workers least likely to be obviated by computerization. So the news is not all bleak. Despite the doomsday talk, despite threats from governors and legislatures, despite very real declines in public support and also in stature, the humanities at American universities have weathered the Great Recession remarkably well. Contrary to conventional wisdom, enrollments have not plummeted nationwide. The newsworthy decline has largely been restricted to Stanford and the Ivy League. It's a problem of the elites, and hardly a crisis there given the enormity of their endowments. But because the top 5 schools get something like 50% of higher education media coverage, an outlier can be mistaken for the norm. If you crunch the numbers, you see that the national percentage of students majoring in humanities has not significantly declined in 30 years. As the big data historian Ben Schmidt has shown, the steep drop-off occurred way back in the 1970s. In other words, the so-called enrollment crisis is only true if your benchmark is the 1960s, when the proportion of majors in core fields such as English reached its maximum. Now, recall in the 60s, female college students, if they were admitted at all, were encouraged to concentrate in a few fields, English being one of them, deemed gender appropriate. Thanks to second-wave feminism, a significant share of college women in the 1970s transitioned away from education and the liberal arts into the social sciences and pre-professional fields like business. I think I can speak for most humanities professors as interpreting this change as progress rather than decline. Now, if the humanities seems to have shrunk after 1980, after enrollments restabilized, that might be a matter of image or definition. Recall that history, my field, used to be categorized as a social science, and humanities used to be synonymous with the classics. In the mid-20th century, it would have been inconceivable for someone like me, a historian who has studied neither Latin nor Greek, to win a major award in the humanities. But as classics departments folded, as pedagogies based on the concept of a Western civilization with a canon of great books encountered fierce critiques from multiculturalism and post-structuralism, and as the American student body became more diverse and international, many alternative disciplines and departments and programs came into being. Compared to 1980, a somewhat smaller proportion of students now studies philological subjects, but a much larger proportion earns degrees in ethnic studies, area studies, media studies, cultural studies, interdisciplinary studies, and so on. Maybe there's even a studies program out there. If you count such degrees as essentially humanistic, and some people don't, but I'm one who would, if you count those degrees as essentially humanistic, the percent of college students majoring in the humanities hasn't changed much since 1980. It's roughly 10%. And I think we ought to celebrate this 10th instead of pathologizing it, accusing these students of being short-sighted naives quixotically pursuing worthless degrees. I wish to honor my history students for choosing a path that is not primarily pecuniary. For decades now, UCLA researchers have been conducting a longitudinal national survey of college freshmen and their attitudes. In the 1970s, as now, the number one goal for going to college was getting a better job. However, in the 1970s, better did not necessarily mean lucrative. Students ranked gaining an appreciation of ideas as more important than making more money. Then, sometime in the first term of Ronald Reagan's presidency, making more money pulled ahead and has never since relinquished that position. Could it be that the relationship between the humanities and capitalism is supposed to be conflicted? As Carolyn Winterer, who's the Humanities Center director at Stanford, has argued, humanities as we know it, as a modern educational endeavor, dates to the Industrial Revolution, and as such was born of crisis. In a time when the rawest and least regulated form of capitalism was increasing owner value by treating proletarian bodies as expendable parts, humanities offered a different form of thinking. The humanistic revival of classicism was not an anti-modern retreat into antiquarianism, but it was a modern critique of materialism, utilitarianism, and the excesses of capitalism in that time. As the nation that imbibed capitalism most fully, the United States has long displayed an ambivalent attitude towards liberal education and the humanities. Our public education system contains a strong current of pragmatism and vocationalism, not to mention a strain of anti-intellectual disdain for humanists. On the other hand, it is the American university that institutionalized the humanities, and it is the post-World War II U.S. state that promoted the American university as a model to the world and defended the humanities as a vital element of a free and open society, and as such as an ideological force against fascism, later communism, and eventually what George W. Bush called Islamofascism. So that's my brief overview of the crises, real and imagined, in the humanities. If you can't tell already, I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future. After all, the humanities are bigger than higher education, which will always have its ups and downs. Many museums and societies and institutes, public and private, not least of which the Dallas Institute are doing great, wonderful work to engage multiple publics. And from within the bunker of academia, I can report that many humanists of my generation, myself included, have embraced digital humanities and re-embraced our public mission. We're creating engaging websites, we're tweeting, blogging, posting videos and data visualizations and interactive maps and so on, in addition to producing monographs. Some of my monographs are on the table, and teaching students. In college and in high school, and I think one of the great things about the Dallas Institute is how it honors and respects high school teachers who get so little respect in our society. And if that's one thing I think you can take away from this organization is the need to respect and value our high school teachers who are really the foundation of the humanities. I mean, people like me, if we encounter students who are already turned off, it's too late. It's really at the high school level where so much of this important work is done. But in the classroom, the humanities of the future looks a lot like the humanities of the past. It's a conversation in which teachers who care about civics will continue to inspire students to be better humans and citizens by studying humanity for its own sake, because we're human. And this will continue in the face of any number of crises because, well, crisis seems to be a normal state of modernity. Now, I want to turn to a slightly different topic, and that is the promise of environmental humanities in a time of planetary crisis. Environmental humanities is an academic buzz phrase that's making the rounds. It's new enough that the people advocating it are still working on a master definition. The goal is to insert the humanities into discussions too long dominated by scientists, economists, and politicians. The premise is that humanists have something unique and valuable to offer contemporary policy discussions about planetary change. Environmental humanities is an outgrowth of what you could call third wave environmentalism, and that's really right now. It's the sense of crisis and opportunity surrounding the recognition and naming of the Anthropocene, or the geologic epoch of humans. The new scientific consensus of the reality of a post-wild world, that is, an awareness that these old dualities between wilderness and artifice, nature and culture, and environment landscape, they simply don't apply to the now irrevocably human-altered biosphere. And this situation presents a grand opening for humanists. There's something very scary about the concept of the Anthropocene, but it's also a wonderful way for the humanities to insert themselves into these discussions that normally or in the past have been dominated by scientists and politicians. Because an anthropogenic crisis is by nature a humanistic crisis involving language, values, and belief systems, as well as questions of economics, governance, and maybe even geoengineering. There is no effective way to address a perfect problem like global warming without ethics and history, the kinds of subjects humanists have been studying for centuries, if not millennia. There is no ethical way to discuss the unequal distribution of the negative effects of climate change, because there will be winners and losers. And the losers in the short term will overwhelmingly be the poor of the world. So humanistic concepts like slow violence and environmental justice, I think, are key to thinking about climate change over the next century. And I will add, I think there's no meaningful way to work through environmental despair without beauty and comedy. In a forthcoming book about people's scientific and also spiritual relationships with long-lived trees around the world, I hope to contribute something beautiful to the discussion on globality. But my work so far, that is the work that earned me this prize, and there are books here, you can look at it, it's primarily local. I wrote 2 books about Utah, 1 about California, and I don't apologize for this kind of local historian mode that I have so far worked in. We live in an age of insurgent globalism, but also resurgent localism. Ideally, one complements the other, a planetary sensibility to match a local sense of place. Earth care begins at home. All politics, even planetary politics, is local. It begins with local concerns. We might do well to invert that famous slogan, think locally, act globally. In this context, I'm intrigued by another academic buzzword, this one coined by environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht. His word is solastalgia. As opposed to nostalgia, that is the pain of being separated from a beloved landscape of home, Albrecht defines solastalgia as the distress that is produced by environmental change impacting on people while they are directly connected to their home environment. In the coming decades, solastalgia will become intensified and magnified as tens or even hundreds of millions of people across the lowlands of the planet, mostly poor people, deal with the same kind of local change, rising sea level. The scale and speed and simultaneity of place loss will be unprecedented. But the experience of environmental distress at home is not by itself new. It is, I'm sorry to say, part and parcel of history. Droughts, famines, wars, conquests, invasions, colonizations, introductions, epidemics, all of these historical forces have produced environmental and social sea changes. Sometimes local people have adapted, survived, even thrived in the long run. Other times they have been overwhelmed, assimilated, exterminated. They have abandoned homelands or been forcibly removed. In my 3 books about landscapes and homelands in the American West, my overarching goal was to get people to look at local scenes with new eyes and to appreciate how the senses of place that make present-day Americans feel at home would not exist without past displacements. Basically, I wanted to provide an education in reading the landscape, especially the local landscape, reading it like a book as a text, and to convince my audience that a moral resident, wherever her home may be, cultivates landscape literacy. If you know how to read the landscape, you feel the presence of the past everywhere, not just in monuments and buildings, but in place names, street alignments, neighborhood boundaries, infrastructure placements, even street tree plantings, a kind of organic infrastructure. In J.B. Jackson's lovely formulation, landscape is history made visible. It is a record of cultural values, a palimpsest of successes and failures, the successive accretions and erosions of social power. Shaping a landscape is always an act of power. Outside of Antarctica and scattered islands, there has been no true terra incognita, land unknown, or terra nullius, land unoccupied, for millennia. No terrestrial space uninhabited, unstoried, unmeaningful. Thus, every act of placemaking has, on some level, been an act of remaking, if not unmaking. But enough talk of crisis and conquest. If you'll indulge me for a few more minutes, I want to end with a statement of professional faith. To me, the traditional justifications for the liberal arts, secular humanism and civic republicanism, remain very persuasive. We are better humans when we know where we come from. We are better democratic citizens when we know the origin and development of our government and civil society. I would add that we're better stewards of the nation and the earth when we apprehend the long shadow of past actions, for then we can imagine the long-term consequences of our current actions. More specifically, I believe the study of history cultivates 4 valuable qualities: empathy, imagination, skepticism, and humility. First, empathy. When we consider people in the past, we try to understand them on their terms. Historians routinely become intimate, so to speak, with dead people who did things that today would be deemed deviant, immoral, or illegal. You don't have to accept absolute moral relativism to be a good historian, but you do have to accept alternative worldviews. By practicing historical thinking, you become more tolerant, more open-minded, you go beyond yourself, and you exercise your compassion as you consider the pervasive injustice, pain, and violence in human history. Second, imagination. It's hard not to be moved by the strangeness and variety of past human experience. By appreciating strangeness, we enlarge our sense of the possible. You've heard the old saying, the past is a foreign country. People there think differently, act differently. They're weird. They behave in confounding ways. They talk funny. They arrange their societies in peculiar forms. They worship different gods. The very strangeness of the past is inspirational in the sense that it reveals to us the vast capacity of human imagination and allows us to imagine different futures. There have been so many religious beliefs, so many gender roles, so many family structures, so many power structures, so many languages, so many artistic, musical, and literary forms, the irrepressible and adaptable force of creativity is an awe-inspiring human tradition. The third quality is skepticism. Historians like me must work with absences. Finding evidence is hard, interpreting it can be harder, because those documents that survive in archives, they contain errors, lies, biases. The meaning of sources is often hidden for the simple reason that these things we call sources were not created for us. Often it requires a tremendous amount of contextualization before their meaning becomes partially clear. Pieces of evidence, written, oral, artifactual, must be weighed against another. A good historian never takes a source at face value. Well-developed skepticism is an everyday virtue too, for we encounter falsehoods all the time. Politicians habitually speak untruths, even on those rare occasions when they don't mean to. Various governments, corporations, and institutions have well-financed departments of deceit. On a more personal scale, our memories routinely deceive us. History can help. Talk to your doctor of philosophy. History is a corrective to the failings of memory, the half-truths of folklore, the truthiness of advertising, and the falsity of propaganda. Finally, humility. The more you know you don't know. You begin to sense the vastness of everything you can never know, the totality of what has been lost. It's humbling. So too when you've read enough histories to realize that all humans, all societies have dealt with the same core issues. The world changes all the time and faster every year, yet the same questions continue to trouble us. What is the purpose of life? What is the value of an individual? What are the proper roles of men, women, and children? What's the best way to allocate resources and divide the burden of labor? What and how should we eat? Which non-human life forms do we include as honorary community members, and how do we best care for them? And so on. There may be no ultimate answers, only temporary, imperfect solutions. And every human, every society has confronted the same ultimate problem, mortality. And this too is humbling. If you combine these four qualities, empathy, imagination, skepticism, humility, I think you get something like what I would call wisdom. Historical wisdom should not be confused with foresight. Many strangers, including some taxi drivers, have asked me upon ascertaining my profession, "So, professor, does history really repeat itself? Are we really doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?" I heard that on the History Channel. There are, of course, famous answers to these familiar questions. Marx, paraphrasing Hegel, remarked that history occurs twice. The first time as tragedy, the second as farce. Ostensibly, Mark Twain said, which means he didn't say it, but Mark Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." My stock response is not so pithy. I say, no, history never repeats itself, but every group of people eventually contends with the same category of mistake, an unintended consequence of a choice that seemed like a really good idea at the time. And it is this process, the unwitting repetition of ironic blundering followed by creative adaptation, that unites human societies across time. Now, I realize my answer is not exactly comforting. The practice of history, unlike the practice of religion, is not designed to provide existential serenity nor material security. It is instead designed to provide philosophical equanimity. The world needs poets, peddlers, prophetesses, and organization men, but it also needs some secular wise men and wise women to put things into perspective. Thank you.
Somewhere along you used the expression slow violence. Explain that, please.
Slow violence, that's a term, it's fairly new. There's an environmental humanist, he's a literature professor at UW-Madison in Wisconsin named Rob Nixon, who wrote a book called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor that not many people have read, but it's had quite an effect on academia. So basically the concept of slow violence is that Well, you know what fast violence is. When you think a gun would be like the epitome of fast violence, a gun to your head. Slow violence would be something like cancer clusters that affect the poor along Cancer Alley, say along the Mississippi River in Louisiana, or like these effects of, say, pollution on environments and people who live in polluted environments that take decades or multiple generations to play out. So it's a kind of structural violence. I guess that's another term, but it's adding this kind of environmental component to the idea of structural violence that many poor people in the world feel the unfair burden of things like environmental pollution. That basically we outsource not just jobs, but we outsource all sorts of our polluting industries, and it is the poor people of the world that bear this burden. But it's not like a wound that you can see necessarily. It's not something that's inflicted in a minute or an hour. It's things that, you know, build up over many years or generations, but are real nonetheless. So that's kind of the context. He says it more eloquently than me, but that's a good book if you want to read it.
Questions? I have one. I want to go back to the first part of your talk, and you know, where you were talking about the university and what it's like to be in the university, the crisis in the humanities, and so forth. And you had to me a striking phrase, self-neutering. Right?
Yeah. I made that up. I think David Brooks actually did use the word suicide. I added self-neutering just because I think people often talk nostalgically about, you know, the good old days when someone like Richard Hofstadter, you know, the great American historian of the mid-20th century, was like a household term. I'm not sure that's even true, but certainly he had a kind of stature that no one in the history, even like someone who's won multiple prizes like this one, would ever have today. But you remember, that was also a time when there were no female historians in top universities, right? And this is a time when all the, you know, great public intellectuals were white men. So I resist that nostalgia a little bit. I think it is true that there has been a lowering in stature of, say, the professoriate in America over the 100 years. Like, you don't necessarily get the respect you used to. Like when you say I'm a doctorate, and I don't know. I think sometimes respect is overrated, but I do sometimes miss when I have Korean students. That's a culture that still deeply respects professors. I have to say it's kind of nice when students come to my office and then like kind of bow at me. I say like, oh, please don't do that, but inside I'm like, oh, that's kind of nice. But I think it's so easy now to be a talking head. It's so easy to find authority figures who often actually speaking untruths. There are far more professors than there were 50 years ago, yet somehow our voices are more diluted or less respected. But I don't want to go back to the good old days when it was like just white men from Yale who were setting the agenda. I want to say people of my generation want to, you know, enter the public conversation from maybe multiple angles and have it be a much more diverse conversation, because the discipline itself is far more diverse than it used to be. And that's a good thing, but you're right, when almost all of the history books that are bestsellers, or I would say 99.9%, are written by non-historians. That is a problem, and that is a sort of an indictment of our profession. If we can't communicate with the public, that is a problem. So I don't want to just totally dismiss that concern, but there is this kind of element of, like, I want to say white man nostalgia about it that I do resist.
But the fact that it feels like you've done it to yourself. I can say that now that I'm out of the university, Steve, but you've done it to yourself.
Right.
You know, it is a form of well, suicide is a strong word.
Yeah, I guess like someone like David Brooks would say that, you know, over the 70s, 80s, 90s, academics just sort of embraced this kind of high theory position, and they stopped writing to the general public. They forgot how. At first, they just chose not to. At some point, they didn't even know how to if they wanted to. And I think that is a problem. Many doctorate programs don't teach teaching or writing. They basically teach you how to talk about books at a really high level, but not how to communicate effectively to multiple audiences, including your own students, I want to say, much less a book reading audience. So I think there is like a sense among scholars, you know, 40 and under, that this is something you need to do. And the number of assistant professors now who have websites, who have blogs, it's almost normal now. It's still not everyone does it, but it's no longer exceptional. And I think that's a great thing. It's easy to encounter professional historians, in the Twitter sphere. Sometimes I'm skeptical about like the overall impact of these things, but people are trying. So there's a lot of good news here.
Right. If we continue this conversation, we have to factor in the element of narcissism, right? Anybody can publish a book, anybody can have a blog, but
right. I mean, you see, like after the events in Ferguson, Missouri, I want to say that was to me, kind of inspiring moment when many very good historians who do have directly relevant expertise, they're not just mouthing off about Israel-Palestine with no expertise. I mean, there are a lot of really great historians of race relations, of the South, of police violence, of the carceral state, any number of things who can talk about this, and they did. There were just a whole spate of really nicely done, well-informed, but beautifully written essays about Ferguson from professional historians. So to me, that was a really bright moment in the historical profession. Yeah.
Dr. Farmer, give us an example of reading the landscape. And, I mean, how would you read the landscape of Dallas, for example?
Of Dallas? Oh, that's a loaded question, because I am sure I know the least about Dallas than anyone in the room except my wife, who comes from Poland. Can I give you an example from California? Is that all right?
Say more about reading.
Okay, sure. Reading the landscape. So I recently wrote a book about California through its trees. It's not a botanical history. It's not a book about trees per se. It's more like a history of California through trees. What can we learn about people in California, about the Golden State, by looking at its trees? It's trees, they're beautiful. We like them. They grow on streets and yards. They grow in the mountains. It's easy just to kind of accept them as just part of the landscape. But in California, it turns out that almost all the trees you're going to see in the lowland parts of the state, which is where almost everybody lives, right? You think about the whole kind of coastal plain of LA, the Central Valley, the lowlands of the Bay Area, that was mostly treeless at the time of statehood in 1850. So this importation of trees, this cultivation of trees, which includes not just street trees and yard trees, but some of the most valuable orchards in the world. This is all the work of humans changing the landscape in a really profound way. So to me, I see what kind of looks like a nice, innocent, pretty landscape. It's, Tree City, USA is a designation that many towns vie for. And I see this as a kind of revolution in the landscape that is beautiful, but it's also, there was also displacement and unmaking that went on, because in lowland California, there were, of course, indigenous people, but also incredibly bio-rich marshlands, wetlands, savannas, grasslands, where you would have just millions upon millions of migratory birds, and all that was destroyed in order to create an environment that's good for trees. And there's both good and bad things in that transformation. So when I see a palm tree now, I don't just see a palm tree. I think of all the ideas behind it. Why do people want palm trees? Why do they want this species of palm tree? Why did they plant it here? What did it mean to them? And what was here before? And it's sort of just this window into history. And I want to say it's a way to engage a different audience. Because not everybody likes reading history books. My books are kind of long. It's not for everybody. But I want to say there's a whole group of people who love trees, who love gardening, who love horticulture. And this is a way to kind of reach that audience who might otherwise not read history books. So it's a way to kind of unite, history with these fields that are sometimes seem very separate, like agriculture or botany or gardening. So that's now kind of a long answer, but I'll work on the Dallas. Yeah, when I hope to come back, and then maybe I can give you a better answer. I want to say the neon on the skyscrapers. Definitely there's a story there about the Sun Belt and Sun Belt design, but.
Well, Dr. Gail Thomas is one to want to talk to when you come
Okay.
back about reading the landscape of Dallas.
Dr. Farmer, do you know of the Alan Alda Center for the Study of Communication of Science at Stony Brook?
Yeah, that's my school. Yeah.
Do you have any connection with that, and might there be some joining of efforts in teaching historians how to communicate science to the general public on the order that ALDA is trying to get scientists to communicate science to the general public.
Yeah, so ALDA, I guess you all know, MASH. I mean, he's a big science nerd, and he's a big booster of my school. So there's the new center within the journalism program about communicating science. The idea being that scientists are some of the most important people in our world now for various reasons, but they're not always the best people to communicate the importance of their findings in language that non-experts can understand. So journalists can step in because journalists are trained to do that. I'm not involved in that. I probably should be, though I'm not a journalist. I want to say that there's a parallel movement, and you can call it environmental humanities or environmental arts. I'm more in that camp. Like, actually, I have no desire to communicate science per se. I want to more like interrogate it, critique it, be a little of a skeptic. Also, like communicating some, but I don't want to just be like a translator figure. When scientists give these big grants, for like the NSF, they often include like a component for public outreach. Like, we got $100 million to study X. Like, oh, you're a humanist. Will you write something for us? That's often kind of like what you get from scientists, and there's a value in that, but I want to say like historians and other humanists can do much more than that, because we are interpreters. We're not just like tellers. We're not just like go-betweens. Our job is to interrogate meaning, or to kind of question the assumptions behind science as well as communicating it. So like in my perfect world, like these big science labs would always have like an artist in residence, and it could be a historian, but it might actually be a dancer or a photographer, someone who could talk to scientists, be in their milieu, learn about their research, but do something that's more like inspired by it, that is like, again, an entry point into science rather than just this kind of service activity of communicating it. And that doesn't require much money. And I just think that there's so much great work that artists could do to put humans back into science. Because I mean, the scientific project is like deeply human, but scientists aren't always very good about sharing the joy of curiosity that goes into it. And I want to see artists can do that. And I want to say like painters and photographers and dancers should be actually in science labs. I would be thrilled about that. So that's kind of a complicated answer, but I think there's a role for journalists, for humanists like me, like historians, but also I want to say like fine artists, to be more involved in the scientific discussion.
Thank you, Jared Farmer. Thank you for the good questions. Okay, we have time for one more over here.
Thanks, Jared. Just a quick question is, I'm curious as to who your personal heroes are and why they're important to you.
Personal heroes? Wow, that's a great... Heroes. Wow. I'm going to have to start with Gustav Mahler, which is like neither here nor there, perhaps, but yeah, Gustav Mahler, the number one hero for me. Tortured genius, composer, yeah. I guess, for me, Edward Abbey was a very formative. I don't care for his writing as much today, but that's like a huge part of kind of my formative thinking.
Give us one title for those of us who don't know.
Edward Abbey?
Yeah.
He was kind of, what would you call Edward Abbey? He was like a redneck, radical environmentalist who was both anti-government and anti-business. I mean, he's probably most infamous for his novel called The Monkey Wrench Gang, which sort of celebrated what I guess the police would call environmental terrorism today, eco-terrorism or monkey wrenching, But his best book by far is Desert Solitaire, which is a kind of a memoir, like half-fictional memoir of being a park ranger in Arches National Park in Utah, where I'm from, in the 1950s.
One more hero?
One more hero. The most important questions are the hardest ones. Magda's my hero, my wife. Wow, I'm gonna think of like the perfect answer in like 1 hour from now.
Dana, will 2 names be enough? Okay.
No, but I mean, like those are, that's gonna haunt me now. Heroes.
You can write it back, or bring it when you come back.
When I
Because
come
we will
back, I'll have a list of heroes.
And, you know, it's wonderful to have you here. Really, your field is just growing. I mean, you know, environmental history, and you're the second one of the 10 Hiett winners to be in that field. So it's going to do nothing but
I hope so. Yeah.
increase. And I love what you said about it. But we're incredibly glad to have you. We're proud of you. We thank you for coming to Dallas, and you are our 2014 Hiett Prize winner.